Kia ora koutou, he mihi poto ki te hunga katoa e mā takitaki ana. Ko Sarah ai ono tōku noa. Thank you very much for joining us today. I'm a member of the Aotearoa Educators Collective, and it's my great privilege to host this discussion today because this is a hugely important discussion that we need to be having, particularly focused on our early years whānau and families and communities involved in the early years sector. So I'd really love to introduce my two guests for this kōrero. Firstly, Fleur Hohaia Rollinson, and secondly, Dr. Lynley Tulloch, both who are co-presidents of OMEP in Aotearoa, the branch. And I'm going to leave them to introduce what OMEP is and what their focus is as an organisation. But firstly, kia ora kōrua, thanks for joining us.
Kia ora, thank you for having us.
Tēnā koe.
So, firstly, let's before we get into why we're here to talk today, can you give me a bit of a very brief summary around OMEP, the organisation, and what it's all about?
Kia ora. So, OMEP Aotearoa is one of 8 member countries, and OMEP World is a global organisation that it's a charitable organisation, and we advocate for children's rights and well-being in the early years, going from 0 to 8. And so Lynley and I are both co-presidents of our Aotearoa branch,
Awesome.
members across Aotearoa, New Zealand.
Yeah. So you will have obviously representing New Zealand's interests, but also you'll have that bigger picture around, for example, the UN rights of the child. You'll be thinking about the OECD and impact on the first 8 years of children's lives through that international lens as well, right?
Aye, we do. And we are affiliated with the United Nations, with UNICEF and UNESCO,
Right.
and the Council of Europe as well.
Right.
So
Okay.
it is a global issue as well as a national issue.
Yeah. So we're not talking about just little old New Zealand here and a few little, concerns that you might have. We're coming at this from a global perspective on the status of the early years sector, on early years education, access to those first few years of interaction for children, young children, and their whānau.
Correct, yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So the reason for our kōrero today is because there is currently the Ministerial Advisory Group convening and looking at the early childhood education funding model in particular, as well as obviously we've had some regulatory reviews and things as well. And you've made submissions to the MAG in response to the proposed changes to the early years funding system. And so that's what we wanted to talk about today and unpack a little bit more. So one of the things that I wanted to just firstly bring up that I've seen in your submissions and others supporting the submissions process that you're involved in is this overarching, before we get into the nuts and bolts of it, the overarching concern that there's been a deliberate ideological shift, right? That we're moving away from this idea of the early years being a service to the community, representing mixed communities and their needs, and the status of teachers in response to what the value of early years is, right? What the point of early years education is. And that we've had that ideological shift that is of concern to the sector. Lynley, would you like to start us off a little bit about what that shift is looking like and what the concerns are specifically?
Yes, well, as you were saying just there is a real concern that there is an ideological shift away from the notion of early childhood education as a public good, one that is available to everybody and is universally funded by the government in much the same way that schools are, and towards and the idea that education should be framed as the MAG put it, a merit good, which is an economic term referring to something that the community benefits from, but that doesn't necessarily mean it needs to be universally funded and that it should be paid for. This is the idea that it can be paid for by families, and that sits quite comfortably in the direction that early childhood education has unfortunately been going in the last 20 to 30 years, which is towards privatisation of the sector, which looks at private ownership of most of the centres in New Zealand, and they are for-profit as opposed to community-based or not-for-profit centres, which is a very contradictory way to understand the notion of education as something that we can profit from. It's a very capitalist neoliberal notion of what education is for. So, that ideological shift is being deepened by this reframing of early childhood education as a merit good as opposed to a public good. It actually stops the conversation around education as a public good because it's already been framed as a merit good, which fits in well with market-based approaches. So that's how I fundamentally see this shift sort of being deepened as opposed to not necessarily a completely new shift, but actually being deepened and the silencing of voices that would say otherwise.
And so what is if we are, and I'm going to, I think I know I know the answer to this, but I want to put this out as a conversation piece, because what you're talking about is the end goal being to make money for a business, if we're looking at it that way. Education has always been about what's best for the child and their family. So if we are going to pursue down that end goal of the business, what is the impact then, or potential impact on children and their whānau if we continue down that pathway towards that merit good?
Yeah, and I think both of us can talk to that quite well. I can just raise a couple of points, being that profit is put over and above the child, and so there might be like an attempt to employ more teachers who are unqualified and they cost less. The centre may not be as well resourced. You might be looking at the rollout of centres that are sort of under a sort of corporate umbrella, which are fairly uniform and not actually responsive to local communities, which we know is really important for ECE. Fleur, would you like to add some points?
I was going to add too that the teacher-to-child ratio could potentially be impacted by this putting profit above early childhood education as a public good as well. So there's many impacts that could affect our early childhood whānau, and that's why we had to raise our concerns about the reframing of the funding for early childhood boards. Using it as a mechanism to support parents back into the workforce. And that's been one of the key points that they've used to support future economic productivity. But that takes it away from it being about the child and the child's right to high quality early childhood education.
And so I guess because I'm conscious of who may be listening, and it won't necessarily be early childhood educators, although I hope there are many, but the wider community. I know that part of the slippery slope that we've had towards this merit good has been because of perhaps a lack of awareness or understanding of the importance of the early years of learning, and that there's always been this push-pull around the early years being more of a babysitting service rather than an education. So if we're looking at, again, these regulatory powers around funding, what's the damage in different ratios, for example? I'm asking a layman's, so what? So how come we need, more teachers for less children? Surely, we can save a buck or two by having, and why do you need really qualified teachers to work with littlies? Well, they just play, don't they? So
I think,
I'm right with you, but I'm, it doesn't here, isn't it, right?
I think Wendy Lee's submission really sums it up really nicely. So she talks about the historical context of our early childhood sector. And, the last 150 years, we have seen huge progress towards a highly qualified and skilled profession of early childhood teachers. And so, over time, there's been, they've played around with how many should be qualified within an early childhood setting. But that's all been part of us trying to improve outcomes for children in society and our families by having a highly qualified, skilled and professional early childhood sector that are working with our youngest tamariki, our youngest mokopuna. And so we want to continue to strengthen funding that supports high quality early childhood education rather than impacted in a negative way, which can see us feeding into those neoliberal approaches, using childhood as a place where parents can place their children and go to work.
I think you touch on a really good point there, around education being a babysitter and the undervaluing of a qualified early childhood education, a professional context. Early childhood teachers know how children learn, and this idea that children learn through play is often misunderstood by lay people who see that as just, well, we're just sitting there and watching them play in the sandpit, or we're watching them do some painting or something along those lines, where qualified early childhood education teachers know that the way children learn is through interactions with Tamariki says, which is our national curriculum, people, places and things. So we know the significance and importance of interactions. And while we also know the significance of play-based learning, we support that play-based learning in ways in which the child is able to extend and lead their own learning, which is really important for their ongoing development and growth, and to become it's not just cognitive growth too. Tamariki talks about holistic learning, which is the child's learning, not just as some people perceive. And actually, I saw a clip by Erica Stanford going into an early childhood. I hope I'm not diversifying much too here, and saying, what wonderful work the teachers were doing. And I'm not saying this to denigrate the work the teachers were doing. I'm sure they're doing some wonderful things. But what she selected was the teachers teaching children how to write letters and letter sound recognition and phonics and so on. And this notion that early childhood education can be collapsed into school readiness is really unsettling, and it shows a very narrow understanding of how early childhood education actually operates in this world. And as Fleur was saying, not this world, in New Zealand, as Fleur was saying, in New Zealand there's been a fight for over 150 years to professionalise early childhood education and to help people to understand this is not just a babysitting service for parents to be able to go back out to work. This is actually a really significant period of time in a child's life through which all their foundations, their holistic lives are, so I'd not say that very well, the foundations of them as holistic beings is nurtured. And to think of the child not just as a future citizen or a future human capital, but as a person in the here and now, and a person with rights, and they have a right to play. And children have a right to an education that supports their culture, their language, their location and family. And we as educators understand the significance of this important grounding. So the point I was trying to make, I've forgotten now in response to what the question actually was. But
I think you've raised a couple of points in there too, and then I want to sort of get into these specifics that we're seeing within the proposed changes. Children's rights are enshrined under the UNCRC, right? You're talking to about this idea of seeing children as this economic output further down the track. And we see this in primary and secondary as well, that we're getting them all ready for the workforce at the other end, and they've got this economic value. We know that the OECD is actually moving away from that idea. And a very favourite report of mine that I'm doing a lot of talking around at the moment is the Human Education for Flourishing, right? And in that report, it says that we actually have to be able to do something different because the economic output model does not work. This is why we are at where we're at in the world now with all the problems we have, is because we've got an education system that we've all adopted that's tried to get people ready for the workforce, and it's not working because people aren't flourishing. The planet isn't flourishing. And so we've got to do things differently. And so when we change this idea of looking at our young people as a future product, and as you say, we see them here and now, what they're here to be able to do and offer and be. I know certainly early years teachers get that the most. They understand that the most. And you touched also on Te Whāriki. I know in my work internationally, the amount of times that I have had people say to me, oh, Te Whāriki, it's just the most beautiful document. Oh, it's just, we'd love to be able to do that. We'd love to have this. And so again, if you come back to some of the goals that our education minister talks about in terms of being a world leading, and world leading in the education sector, that we want to be able to have children having great outcomes and all the rest, then it does make sense that we get the early years right first.
And if we're talking historical progression in the early childhood sector, you don't have to look much further than how Te Whāriki was developed purposely and intentionally as a bicultural curriculum document underpinned by Te Tiriti o Waitangi.
Yeah.
So, we want to be world leading, and we are known as world leading in the early childhood sector for our play-based bicultural curriculum.
Absolutely.
So that's something we really want to protect. And if you look at the principal strands and goals of Te Whāriki, it's all about children's rights to high quality education for them and their whānau.
Yeah, and that responds and sustains culture, and also thinks it is upholding Te Tiriti. So if you see what's happening now with this funding review, you can see it as an act of colonisation. We're using the early childhood education system to if you like to think of the factory model of children as being fodder going through this factory and coming out as this product. And it's actually making invisible and normalising late-stage capitalist neoliberal development, because we're the attempt of this notion is saying that we want children who are going to be able to participate and be productive in the workforce years from now, and we want to support parents going and be productive and participating in the workforce in the here and now. What they're not doing is looking at children and their rights in the here and now and in this place, and what does it mean to be a Māori tamaiti today, and what are our obligations under Te Tiriti. And those are being, today more than ever, under this current coalition government, they are being undermined in the most horrendous way possible, right under our noses. And I think there's a sense of powerlessness about how can we speak back to this? How can we actually speak back and say this isn't okay, hands off our education system and hands off our obligations under Te Tiriti, because that's an unjust model, and it doesn't uphold children's rights, and it doesn't uphold the rights of Indigenous people in Aotearoa.
And I think so. If we think about what they're trying to do with this particular funding model, and the way that they're trying to degrade that and lessen the obligations and the reflection of Te Tiriti and our bicultural status and rights of the children. In your submissions, you talked about For example, I mean, we've already kind of covered that equity of access, right? That quality of education. Every child has a right to quality education, no matter where they live, no matter where in society they are or their whānau are. But more sort of specific, nuanced things like separating out the teaching standards from the rest of the teaching profession. I think we also mentioned in your submission, even on the MAG itself, am I correct to say there's actually no teachers represented on the MAG? Is that right?
No, there's not. Yeah, it's correct.
So no teachers represented, no not-for-profit or community-based providers, so no kindergartens presented. So I'm a kindergarten graduate, right?
Wonderful.
From kindergarten. There'll be many people, perhaps, people listening at the moment, so, some may be parents of young children, toddlers, but, there's going to be potentially an older demographic listening to this as well, who may have grandchildren. That institution of kindergarten, right, is not being represented in this current discussion. I would then assume that kohanga are not going to be represented.
No.
So, these are all the little barbs that are eroding, right? What else is happening with this that we would see just the little poisoned chalices that are sitting in here?
Oh, I do like your language. Claire, do you want to respond to that?
Go, Lindley.
Child poverty is another area of huge concern with this, because we know that there's already inequitable access to early childhood education due to the for-profit sector, and that there's a proliferation of centres that are perhaps of, how do we say, lesser quality, while also acknowledging that quality is a word that can be put in inverted commas. Or how do we define quality? Well, lower child teacher ratios, high qualified staff that are highly qualified to, hopefully 100% highly qualified staff. These centres that are attracting those staff and the retention of staff, so the children aren't having constant changes in their kaiako. They are most likely to be located in areas that have got more challenges from a socioeconomic perspective. So you've seen this idea of privilege sort of being reenacted, if you like. So I think, when I was when we were putting together the OMEP submission, we were looking at poverty, and Susan St. John's work saying that the government's Child Poverty 2026 release last week shows the statistics release shows that New Zealand is far from on track to meet its goal of reducing child poverty to 6% by 2028, which is the goal. And that it's calculated currently to be sitting at 14.3% in the financial year of 2024-25. So this brings us back to the idea that the current MAG Ministerial Advisory Group has on funding, that we give additional funding to target those groups that are identified as most at need. Now, that in and of itself, at first blush might seem to be a great idea. Okay, so they even use the word equity, and this is one of the dangers of neoliberal language, is that it can actually sneak in and go undercover, if you like. First and foremost, we need universal funding so that all child have got access to education for all. And then if there is a need for target funding after that, then we put that in place. It's not just a matter of having inequitable access and then targeting certain groups. It also leads to pathologizing of certain groups too, which is problematic. So again, we need to come back to, we don't start with education as a merit good, we start with education as a public good, with fully qualified and certified teachers working directly with children, implementing Te Whāriki and enacting Te Tiriti in a meaningful way, responding linguistically and culturally to children, and being embedded in communities, because Te Whāriki is a mat for all people to stand. That is a metaphor. And this current funding review suggests that it's a place that only some children can stand with confidence and others are just excluded from the map. Thank you very much. So we really need to fight against it. As Fleur was saying, there's been 150 years of building up this world-class document and this world-class practice. Te Whāriki in action. It's not just a document, it actually is enacted. And it's a bicultural document as well, which is significant. And we're losing all of that. It's just not even being talked about.
No, Fleur, did you want to add to that?
Yeah, I was just going to say that these are what could be compromised. You know, like we've said in our submission, so OMEP Aotearoa is often writing submissions, you know, as a voice and advocate for children's rights, and in, you know, by turn, families and society's rights. But it's about the transparency, you know, and you've raised that really good point about who is on the ministerial advisory group, whose voices are being heard, and make that a priority in our work to contribute to policy decisions. And hopefully our voices are heard as we advocate for children. I think so, if we're thinking about what Linley was saying, it was also about transparency for families, about costs. You know, like when you're making a decision about going back to work, how much is it going to cost for my child to be in a kindergarten or an early childhood centre? What does that look like now in the context of Aotearoa, New Zealand, with rising living costs and child poverty and more homelessness as our children living and sleeping in cars. So I think I just wanted to make that point that, you know, our submission, we write these submissions and we collaborate with our early childhood communities, and you'll see other ECE community like NZEI as well, and some kindergarten organisations, they're writing submissions. Historians and academics in our early childhood sector, we're all writing submissions. We've never been so active as we have in this last term.
I'm aware of in-home care providers as well, writing submissions too. I want to come back just for a moment on, again, from a layman's perspective, the connection between poverty and early years education, right? Because I know, having mokopuna myself, there is a ability in the early years to be able to catch concerns or spot things in a way that maybe would not be seen if a whānau are not engaging with a health service or are not engaging with a, you know, housing provider or something like that. Often the early years teacher and the early years setting is the least confronting for whānau if whānau are struggling or having a problem, right? So it's not just that children are going along and we want to protect their opportunity for education, but again, stepping back slightly and going, well, actually, you know, it's a place where there are other eyes on health, other eyes on whānau, where, you know, early childhood educators are able to see, again, holistically, how a child's going, and this is the connection as well. So again, for a public good perspective, this is the top of the cliff stuff, not the bottom of the cliff. Would that be fair to say?
Good question. Absolutely. I would agree with that. It's actually quite dire. I'm aware of children that are going to centres long enough, staying in them before they pay their fees, 20 hours free ECE, but it's not free, and then moving on to another centre. And this constant moving the child on, so there's no continuity, so that they can avoid paying fees because they can't afford the fees. So there's that as well. And as Fleur was saying, children sleeping in cars, as you're talking about, is this ambulance at the bottom of the cliff? Is it creating the situation where children who might benefit from certain services are not being identified and supported through relevant agencies because there's not enough qualified staff to pick it up in the first place? Yeah.
Yeah.
So
and have relationships with services as well that are coming in and out too of the centres as well.
Yeah, that's 100%.
So the other question I wanted to just ask as well is teacher morale and this concept, again, if we're painting this picture of the early years being just a bit of play and a bit of a babysitting service, and we're wanting to attract quality teachers in front of our the most important years in a child's life, for many things, but educationally one of them. If we're looking at that idea of less qualified people in front of kids, what does that mean in terms of things like attracting good staff, pay conditions, professional learning conditions, all that kind of stuff? What's involved there for the profession? Fleur, do you want to share?
Well, it is a very big area that has drawn lots and lots of attention, and it's rightfully so. Attracting and retaining early childhood teachers has been an ongoing issue. Even before COVID, we were struggling to attract and retain them, and pay parity has become a huge issue. This ECE funding review is not helping with that because it's going to be looking at whether it could be affecting the funding bands for qualified and registered teachers, where we would be advocating for, without a doubt, if you're looking at the funding review, pay parity and 100% qualified teaching staff is what we would like to see in our early childhood sector. And that has implications with a privatised and corporate early childhood sector. And you'll see many early childhood sectors at the moment. Many are still being built in areas since they removed the network management resource where you had to prove there was a need in your community. So that has since gone, and now you can open an early childhood centre. So now we've got multiple early childhood centres open in one community where they already had 3.
And that comes competition.
That's right, which stretches our early childhood teacher workforce. So if you're looking at a less qualified teacher workforce, then that works, doesn't it, for that private and market model?
And I suppose you can then offer cheaper fees, and then you can get more customers into the centre, which is effectively our parents, right? Who want
and still apply for government funding.
Yeah. Anything else that we're missing here around the submissions? I know, all of this, these are big topics, but is there anything else for you that you'd want people to know about that's happening at the moment with this review?
I think we've touched on the deprofessionalisation of early childhood education teachers, and that's a significant thing that needs to be looked at, because it's the silences and the gaps in the review that I'm seeing. There's not a push for qualified teachers in centres. There's not this recognition that that is absolutely essential in terms of the quality of education young children might experience. So, it's deeply.
As a parent and a grandparent, I just think it's absolutely nuts that you wouldn't want the very best in front of your children.
And I think parents do.
Yeah.
I think parents genuinely do, but, we're in really tough times, aren't we? And, teachers are working incredibly hard under very difficult conditions, to actually, I can't speak for teachers because I'm not working in an early childhood education context at the moment I'm working as an early childhood education lecturer, in initial teacher education, but I have worked, maybe 10 years ago was the last time I was working in ECE, so things have undoubtedly changed.
Challenging. Yeah.
Yeah, since then. But I do, have contact with centres and talk to teachers and also, so on. So I do have some interface there. I couldn't speak overall the morale, but I can imagine that if you're in a very busy centre that's taking shortcuts in order to make sure that they're profiting as much as they can. I mean, I probably won't say, but I was just thinking about when I was working a while ago in a centre and the shortcuts that we've taken even then are worrying. And that's because the profits are getting eaten into,
Yeah.
and it's not putting the child at the centre at all. It's putting profits at the centre. And we just come back to this again and again and again.
And
So,
thinking about the quality of the experience that child has in the first few years of their time in an education setting. Yeah.
absolutely.
Yeah.
And being embedded, what worries me a lot is this idea of, ECE has been a service for parents so that they can go to work. It really takes away the richness of what early childhood education is under the Tamariki curriculum and all the richness that has been built up from years of advocacy from people in the sector is just been eroded from this idea that it's a place to put your children and that the staff don't need to be 100% qualified. What if it was said about schools? Oh, sorry, we don't need fully qualified teachers in schools. This whole idea that if you're teaching at early childhood, that it's somehow less or it's not as difficult
Well,
to
but
teach.
Lindley, they do real learning at school.
Yeah,
Real learning. It's just a bit of haunting and making friends in the early years, isn't it?
Yeah, yeah.
This is the rhetoric that has haunted the early years, isn't it? This is why there's the struggle to get the validity of it. But pointing out now the significant information we have around how the brain forms in the early years and the critical period of learning that happens before the age of 5 in New Zealand.
Yeah.
I'm choosing 5 because of our school age, but we know up to 8, right? So it's not that there's a lack of evidence around it. The evidence just doesn't fit the narrative.
Yeah,
And as we say, we keep coming back to that idea of the merit good, and we've been able to separate that out in a way that I actually think they'd love to do that for school as well, because that takes a big bill off the government. There's got to be a level of public education, gosh darn it. But certainly we can, have a good crack at the early years, right? Because there's already much more erosion in there than there has been in the school sector. I absolutely total your concerns there. Fleur, did you have anything to add before we finish up?
Yeah, I was just going to add and draw, further talk to Lindley's points. I think parents do expect, the teachers in front of their children every day to genuinely care for their child and genuinely want to be teaching and learning alongside their child in every interaction and everything they do. Between education and care routines within an early childhood setting and using play as our pedagogical approach. I think the idea that it's participatory and they want to keep, they keep saying this, increasing participation, that long-term maternity care, which is in maternity leave or paternity leave for parents to be their choice, that is long and extended in other countries for 1 or 2 years, shows their government's belief in those early years being the most important, and that it's parents a choice about staying home or putting their using early childhood services. So using participation in a workforce really narrows the profession. What you brought back to a babysitting service while they go to work. And I think, we've had the regulatory review. So I think everybody parents, grandparents, society should be really concerned when regulations are being reviewed that are put in place to keep your child safe and healthy in the early childhood context and working to a high quality curriculum. And lastly, that accountability is so important. So part of this review is, trying to remove the administrative paperwork. Actually, we still need to be accountable, and every early childhood service needs to be accountable for the education and care they provide for children and families.
Yeah, and that's another big topic, right? In terms of what the dangers are if there isn't that accountability there, and the very real danger to our children if there
Very
isn't that
real danger.
accountability.
Yeah.
So, and particularly our most vulnerable children, and we certainly should be, considering that in light of things like the Oranga Tamariki, investigations and things that have gone on around care and state care and things like all of that. I mean, that's a whole other Substack, I think, related to the regulatory stuff, right?
There is a whole nother Substack if we look at Australia and some of the things that have been happening over there, because this is where we're going, right?
Yeah.
So, we've got to be really concerned about where early childhood education is going. And I think Fleur just made an absolutely excellent point that I hadn't sort of, cognised before. Thanks, Fleur. Around, let's not just take the funding review in isolation.
No.
Let's look at it alongside the regulatory review.
Yeah.
And this is a constant, rapid fire attack on early childhood education and education in schools and universities more generally. Yeah. So I think that we don't just think of it in isolation.
No, it's the playbook though, right? At the moment, we're seeing this across the education sector, this rapid fire stuff. Certainly from a school sector perspective, we're absolutely, being hit left, right and centre. Secondary are now starting to take the attack, and then, the early years is coming in as well. So, I think what's been lovely in the conversation that we've had is that it's raised the point around continuing to make submissions, continuing to make voices heard. While the cynic in me says that we've got a government that doesn't listen, I think we, at the very least need to be on record that there were considerable concerns raised, because that we hope the government changes, but we know there will be a change, whether it's in this November or in 3 years' time. There will come a change, and then things will be reviewed again, and regulations will be reviewed again, and we have a matter of record that there have been these concerns, and people, didn't stay silent, I think is the big thing, right? Because our children deserve that at the very, very least. They deserve people to not stay silent. Yeah. Oh, look, thank you so much for your time and for sharing your whakaaro and the points that you've made in relation to your submission. Remind everyone the deadline for submissions, if it's still open, can they put a submission in, or is it closed?
It's closed on the 6th of August.
Okay.
But, we need to rise up. We need to rise up, and we need to speak out, and we need to speak out in any way that we can against the changes that are currently being made. So,
and that can be just with whānau, if you're in a setting and you want to share your concerns. I think one of the really interesting things that came out of, just to slightly aside as we wrap up, one of the interesting things that came out of the OECD when they were looking at promoting flourishing is that they make a point within their report about leadership, and that leaders now need to be speaking out if there is not the flourishing happening. And I think that that's quite a fundamental shift from generally leaders are apolitical and try and, not get into the sort of bipartisan conversations. But I think we have a duty of care, which means that we do need to talk to our communities and make things much more clearer about what the impact will be. So on a local level, that can happen right through to, contacting your local MP, wanting to have conversations, going further if you want to, if you're much more sort of out there as an advocate, find your way of making this known to people in around you, right?
And join OMEP, join OMEP. Why not? Yeah,
Like,
that's a great space. That's
yeah,
a great space. You
yeah,
know, it's
yeah,
where we come together as a collective, and we need to rise up as a collective.
yeah.
And so the more people we have, the more we're able to, our voice gets louder. Remember the story of Horton and the elephant? You know? Oh,
Yeah,
and he found the little who's on the little thing.
yeah,
Yeah, so we need all our voices
yeah,
to be exemplified and to really shout out against what's
yeah,
happening here unapologetically.
yeah,
Very
absolutely.
unapologetically, and
Yeah,
question their notions. If they say equity, have a look and think, well, hang on a minute.
yeah,
You're
absolutely.
marrying equity up with neoliberal capitalism. I don't know about that. Let's have a little think.
There's a lot of words, right?
Let's have a Yeah.
Thank you so much for you
Okay.
both, and we'll put a link for people to learn more about OMEP as well. When
Sure.
they listen to this as well. So thank
Great.
you.
Kia
Um,
ora.